Welcome to Office Revenge Hub. Relax and enjoy today's story.
I was forced out of the company I helped build, but I came back on my own terms, and they never saw it coming. My name is Marcus Chen, and for 6 years, I was the Director of Operations at Vertex Solutions, a mid-sized tech consulting firm in Seattle. I wasn't just another employee. I was the person who came in at 5 in the morning to prep for client presentations. I was the one who stayed until midnight debugging systems when everyone else went home. I built the operational framework that turned Vertex from a struggling startup into a 7-figure business. When I joined, we had 12 employees working out of a cramped office above a sandwich shop. The founder, Richard Caldwell, was brilliant but scattered. He could sell a vision like nobody's business, but he had no idea how to deliver on his promises. That's where I came in. I created the project management systems. I hired and trained the ops team. I standardized our client delivery process so we could actually scale without imploding. Richard used to call me his right hand. He'd pull me into meetings with investors and say I was the reason Vertex actually functioned. I believed him. I thought we were building something together. I turned down 3 job offers in those 6 years because I genuinely believed in what we were creating. I worked through my father's funeral because we had a critical product launch. I postponed my wedding twice because Richard said he needed me for major pitches. My fiancée, Sarah, was patient, but I could see the frustration building. I kept telling her it would be worth it. Once we got past this milestone, once we closed that deal, once we hired more people, the things would calm down. They never did. By year 5, Vertex had grown to 80 employees and $15 million in annual revenue. We'd expanded into 3 cities. I'd built an operations team of 12 people who ran like a machine. Our client retention rate was 94%, almost unheard of in our industry. I wasn't just proud of the work, I was proud of the culture we'd built. People actually wanted to work at Vertex. Then Richard brought in a consultant. Her name was Victoria Marsh, and she came from one of those big strategy firms where everyone wears expensive suits and talks in frameworks. Richard hired her to help us prepare for a potential acquisition. A private equity firm was circling, and Richard wanted to maximize our valuation. Victoria would spend 3 months evaluating our operations and making recommendations. I wasn't worried at first. I'd built solid systems. Our metrics were strong. I figured she'd validate what we'd accomplished and maybe suggest some minor optimizations. Our first meeting should have been a warning sign. Victoria walked into the conference room with 2 associates carrying laptops and binders. She didn't shake my hand. She sat down, opened her laptop, and said her first priority was understanding why our operational costs were so high relative to revenue. I explained our cost structure. We invested heavily in training. We maintained redundancy in critical roles to prevent burnout. We paid above market rates to retain top talent. These weren't inefficiencies. They were strategic decisions that drove our industry-leading retention numbers. Victoria smiled in that way consultants do when they think you're naive. She said retention was nice, but private equity firms care about margin optimization and scalability. She said our operational philosophy was outdated. Over the next 6 weeks, Victoria was everywhere. She sat in on team meetings. She interviewed my staff. She reviewed every process document I'd created. Her associates shadowed my operations managers, taking notes on everything. I tried to be collaborative. I walked her through our systems. I explained the reasoning behind our approaches. I shared data showing how our investments in people directly correlated with client satisfaction and revenue growth. She nodded politely and wrote things down. But then she started having private meetings with Richard. Long meetings with the door closed. I'd walk past the conference room and see them looking at spreadsheets. Victoria pointing at numbers. Richard nodding seriously. I asked Richard what they were discussing. He said they were just exploring options, nothing to worry about. Victoria was very impressed with what we'd built. This was all standard due diligence. I wanted to believe him. 2 months into Victoria's engagement, Richard called me into his office on a Friday afternoon. It was April 12th. I remember because it was the day before Sarah's birthday, and I'd actually managed to leave work early enough to take her to dinner. Richard looked uncomfortable. He couldn't meet my eyes. He asked me to close the door and sit down. He said the business was evolving. The PE firm's interest was real, but they had specific requirements for the management structure. They wanted a more traditional operational hierarchy. They wanted someone with experience scaling companies past the $50 million mark. I said I could learn. I'd always learned. That's how I'd built everything we had. Richard shook his head. He said Victoria had done a comprehensive assessment. She'd identified significant inefficiencies in how we ran operations. The PE firm had reviewed her report, and they had concerns about whether our current leadership could execute at the next level. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked him directly, was he firing me? He didn't use that word. He said they were restructuring. They were bringing in a new chief operating officer with private equity experience, as someone Victoria had recommended. My role would be transitioned over the next 30 days. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing. 6 years, I'd given 6 years of my life to this company. I'd built the entire operational foundation. I'd sacrificed relationships, health, time with my family. And now some consultant who'd been here for 8 weeks was telling Richard I wasn't good enough. I asked what the new COO had that I didn't. Richard said it wasn't about what I lacked. It was about what the business needed for this next phase. He said I should be proud of what I'd accomplished. I'd always have a place in Vertex's history. But sometimes companies outgrow their early leaders. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I asked if there was anything I could do, any way to prove I could handle the next level. Richard finally looked at me. He looked almost sad. He said the decision was made. The PE firm wouldn't move forward unless we made this change. He said he was sorry, but this was business. I'd understand when I had some distance. He offered me a severance package, 4 months of salary and continued health insurance for 6 months. He said it was generous, considering I didn't have a formal employment contract with specific termination terms. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just nodded and stood up. Richard said I could take the weekend to process, but he needed me to start the transition on Monday. The new COO would be starting in 2 weeks. Richard wanted me to create documentation for all my processes and introduce her to the team. He wanted me to train my replacement. I left his office in a daze. Now I walked past my team's desks. They were laughing about something, completely unaware that their director had just been fired. I grabbed my jacket and left the building without telling anyone. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes. I kept replaying the conversation, trying to find the moment where I could have changed the outcome, wondering what I'd done wrong. I called Sarah. I could barely get the words out. She was furious, but not at me. She said Richard was spineless. She said I should fight this. Talk to a lawyer. Tell the board what was happening. I said there was no board. Richard owned the company. And what would a lawyer do? I didn't have a contract. Washington is an at-will employment state. They could fire me for any reason. Sarah said I should at least make them acknowledge what I'd built, so make them pay me what I was worth. But I was tired. I was so tired. I told her I'd just take the severance and figure out what came next. That weekend was a blur. I told my parents I'd left Vertex to pursue other opportunities. I couldn't bring myself to say I'd been fired. My father had always been so proud that I was a director at a growing company. I didn't want to see disappointment in his eyes. Sarah tried to be supportive, but I could tell she was worried. We had a mortgage. We'd been planning to start trying for a baby in the next year. We'd built our financial plans around my salary and the stock options Richard had promised me but never formalized. Those stock options. God, I'd been so stupid. Richard had talked about them for years, told me as soon as we closed the PE deal, he'd make sure I was taken care of. And I'd have equity. I'd be a real partner in the business. I'd believed him because I wanted to believe him. Monday morning, I went back to the office. I felt like I was walking through water. Everything looked the same, but it all felt different. I was already a ghost. I met the new COO. Her name was Jennifer Hartley, and she had an MBA from Wharton and 12 years of experience at companies I'd only read about. She was competent, professional, and completely uninterested in understanding why we did things the way we did. She wanted my documentation. She wanted org charts and process flows and key contact lists. She wanted everything that was in my head transferred to documents so she could run operations her way. I spent 2 weeks writing everything down, every system I'd built, every relationship I'd cultivated, so every lesson I'd learned through trial and error. I documented it all because that's who I was. Even after being betrayed, I couldn't bring myself to sabotage the company. My team was confused. Richard had announced the restructuring in an all-hands meeting, framing it as an exciting evolution for the company. He said I was moving on to pursue other opportunities, and we should all be grateful for my contributions. Some of my people tried to talk to me privately, but I didn't know what to say. I just kept my head down and finished the transition. On my last day, there was a small gathering in the break room. Someone had bought a cake. Richard made a short speech about my contributions and wished me well. People clapped politely. Jennifer stood in the back with her arms crossed, all clearly ready for this to be over so she could get back to work. I cleaned out my desk. 6 years fit into 2 boxes. I'd accumulated so little physical stuff because I'd always been too busy working to personalize my space. I carried the boxes to my car and drove home in the middle of the afternoon. Sarah was at work. The house was quiet. I set the boxes in the garage and went inside. I sat on the couch and stared at the wall. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check my phone. I just sat there feeling completely hollow. This wasn't supposed to happen. I'd done everything right. I'd worked hard. I'd been loyal. I'd sacrificed. And none of it mattered because some consultant decided I wasn't scalable enough. The first week after leaving Vertex was disorienting. I'd structured my entire adult life around that job. I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. out of habit, then remember I had nowhere to go. Sarah tried to keep things normal. She'd leave for work and tell me to take my time figuring out next steps. Don't rush into anything. Take a few weeks to decompress. But I couldn't decompress. I kept checking my work email even though I'd been locked out of the system. I kept thinking about projects my team was working on and wondering if Jennifer knew about the quirks in our largest clients' requirements. I felt completely disposable. I started applying for jobs in the second week, director of operations roles at other tech companies. I had a strong resume. I'd scaled a company from 12 to 80 employees. I'd built systems from scratch. I should have been an attractive candidate. But every interview felt like I was explaining a failure. Why did you leave Vertex after 6 years? The company was restructuring for a new growth phase. Were you let go? We mutually agreed it was time for new leadership. So you were fired? I wouldn't characterize it that way. But you were asked to leave? Eventually, I just started saying yes. I was let go during a restructuring, and I could see the shift in interviewers' eyes, the slight hesitation, the note they'd make on their papers. Nobody wants to hire someone who just got fired. I made it to final rounds for 2 positions. Both times I was told they were moving forward with other candidates. They said I was strong, but they found someone who was a better cultural fit. Cultural fit. That phrase became my nightmare. By week 6, I was spiraling, and I'd lie awake at night doing math. Our savings would last maybe 4 more months if we were careful. Sarah's salary covered the mortgage and utilities, but not much else. We'd have to dip into our emergency fund soon. Sarah never complained, but I could feel the tension. We'd stopped talking about the future. No more discussions about kids or vacation plans or the kitchen renovation we'd been planning. We just focused on getting through each day. I started having panic attacks. The first one hit me in the grocery store. I was looking at my cart, calculating the cost of everything, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My chest got tight. The lights felt too bright. I abandoned the cart and went outside to sit in the car until my hands stopped shaking. I felt broken. I'd built my entire identity around being competent and reliable, the person who could fix problems and deliver results. Now I was unemployed, burning through savings and having panic attacks in public places. I stopped telling Sarah when I had bad days. I'd say the job search was going fine. I had some promising leads, nothing concrete yet, but I was optimistic. I wasn't optimistic. I was terrified. At night, I'd replay every decision I'd made at Vertex. Every time I'd said yes when I should have pushed back. Every boundary I'd let Richard cross. Every red flag I'd ignored because I wanted to believe I was building something meaningful. I'd been so naive. I thought about Richard living his life completely unaffected by what he'd done to me. Closing his PE deal, probably making millions while I struggled to pay bills. It made me physically ill. But more than Richard, I was angry at myself. I'd handed him 6 years of my life. I'd let him convince me that loyalty and hard work would be rewarded. I'd been so desperate to matter, to be essential, that I'd made myself completely vulnerable. The worst part was the silence. None of my former team members reached out after the first week. I'd worked alongside these people for years. I'd mentored them, supported them, fought for their raises and promotions, and now, nothing. Maybe Jennifer had told them not to contact me. Maybe they were just too busy adapting to the new regime, or maybe I'd never mattered as much to them as I'd thought. That realization was almost worse than losing the job. Week 8, I was sitting in my home office staring at job listings when Sarah came home early. She sat down across from me and said we needed to talk. My stomach dropped, and I thought she was going to say she couldn't do this anymore, that she needed a partner who had their life together, that she was tired of watching me spiral. Instead, she asked me a question. What did I actually want? I didn't understand. I wanted a job. I wanted to stop feeling like a failure. She shook her head. That's what I thought I should want. But what did I actually want? If I could design my career from scratch, right now, what would it look like? I didn't have an answer. I'd been so focused on trying to get back to where I was that I hadn't thought about whether I even wanted to go back. Sarah said she'd been watching me for 2 months. I was trying to recreate my life at Vertex, applying for the same type of roles at the same type of companies. But I'd been miserable at Vertex. I'd been stressed and overworked and taken for granted long before Richard fired me. Did I really want to do that again at a different company? I said I didn't know how to do anything else. Sarah pulled out her laptop. She showed me searches she'd been doing, fractional COO positions, consulting opportunities, contract operations work, companies that needed someone to build systems and processes but didn't need a full-time executive. She said I was brilliant at building operational infrastructure. That was my superpower. But I'd been trying to force myself into a full-time corporate role when maybe that wasn't what served me anymore. What if I worked for myself? The idea terrified me. I'd never considered independent work. I liked the security of a salary and benefits. I liked being part of a team, but Sarah pointed out I didn't have security. Richard had proven that, and the team I'd thought I was part of had evaporated the moment I left. She said she wasn't pushing me to decide right now, but she wanted me to at least consider it. Stop trying to go back to what was broken. Start thinking about what I actually wanted to build. That conversation was the first time in weeks I felt something other than despair. It was a small flicker, just possibility. But it was something. I started researching that night. Fractional executive work, interim operations leadership. Companies hired people like me to come in for 3 to 6 months to solve specific problems or build specific systems. Then they'd move on to the next engagement. The model made sense. Companies got expertise without the cost of a full-time executive. I got variety and control over my schedule and the ability to choose who I worked with. But I'd need clients. I'd need to build a reputation. I'd need to network and market myself in ways I'd never done before. The old Marcus would have been paralyzed by all the unknowns, but I wasn't the old Marcus anymore. The old Marcus had trusted systems and loyalty and doing the right thing. The old Marcus had gotten crushed. I needed to become someone different. I started small. I reached out to 3 people in my network who ran growing companies. I offered to do a free operational assessment, 1 hour of my time to review their systems and give them recommendations. No strings attached. 2 of them took me up on it. The first was a woman named Keisha, who ran a marketing agency. She had 20 employees and was struggling to scale. Her team was overworked. Projects were slipping through the cracks. And she didn't know how to fix it without hiring more people she couldn't afford. I spent 2 hours with her reviewing how she managed projects and resources. I gave her a framework for standardizing her delivery process. I showed her how to implement capacity planning so she could identify bottlenecks before they became disasters. She was blown away. She said I'd solved in 2 hours what she'd been struggling with for months. She asked what I charged for consulting work. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I made up a number that felt high enough to be taken seriously, but low enough that she wouldn't walk away. She hired me on the spot, 20 hours of consulting to implement the framework we discussed. The second assessment led to a similar outcome. A startup founder named James needed help building operational systems before his next funding round. He wanted investors to see he had his infrastructure together. He hired me for a 3-month contract to build everything from scratch. Suddenly I had 2 clients. It wasn't a lot of money yet, but it was proof of concept. I could do this. I told Sarah that night. She cried, not sad tears, relief. She said she'd been waiting for me to find my way back to myself. Over the next 3 months, I poured everything into those 2 engagements. I showed up early. I delivered more than I promised. I made sure both clients felt like hiring me was the best decision they'd made all year. And I started to remember why I'd loved operations work in the first place. I loved solving puzzles. I loved taking chaos and creating order. I loved teaching people how to think systematically about their businesses. At Vertex, that passion had been buried under politics, and Richard's manipulation and the constant pressure to do more with less. Now I was rediscovering what it felt like to just do great work and have it be appreciated. Keisha referred me to 2 other agency owners. James introduced me to 3 startups in his accelerator cohort. By month 6, I had 7 clients and a waiting list. I raised my rates. Then I raised them again. Clients kept saying yes because I delivered results. I wasn't just another consultant making recommendations that never got implemented. I stayed until the work was done. I made sure people had the tools and training to sustain what I'd built. Word spread. By the end of my first year working independently, I'd worked with 19 companies. I'd made more money than I'd ever made at Vertex, and I'd done it working reasonable hours with clients I actually respected. I wasn't having panic attacks anymore. I wasn't lying awake at night feeling disposable. I was building something real, and this time it belonged to me. Sarah and I started talking about the future again. We planned a vacation. We restarted conversations about having kids. We got our lives back. But I hadn't forgotten about Vertex. I just stopped letting it consume me. Then one day I got a LinkedIn message from someone named David Park. He said he was on the board of a mid-sized company called Nexus Dynamics. They were struggling with operational chaos and looking for someone to come in and fix their systems. Someone had recommended me. I checked out Nexus Dynamics. They were in the industrial automation space, 85 employees, 20 million in revenue, growing fast but drowning in their own complexity. David wanted to meet for coffee. We met at a cafe downtown. David was in his 50s, sharp and direct. He said Nexus had reached the point where they couldn't scale further without serious operational infrastructure. Their CEO was brilliant on the technical and sales side, but had no interest in operations. They needed someone to own that domain entirely. He asked if I did full-time interim executive work. I said I typically worked with multiple clients, but I was open to discussing dedicated engagements for the right situation. David said they'd want me for at least 6 months, probably longer. They'd pay a significant premium over my consulting rate, and if it worked out, now there might be an opportunity to formalize something longer term. I said I'd need to review their current state before committing. David agreed. He set up a day for me to come to their office and meet the team. That meeting was illuminating. Nexus was exactly where Vertex had been 5 years ago. Growing fast, chaotic systems, team members doing 3 jobs each, no standardization or documentation. The CEO, a guy named Tom Rivera, was overwhelmed but didn't know where to start fixing things. I saw myself in that chaos. The younger version who'd thought hard work and good intentions were enough. I spent 3 hours asking questions and reviewing their current processes. Then I went home and wrote up a comprehensive assessment. I outlined exactly what was broken, why it was broken, and what I'd do to fix it. And I sent the proposal to David with my terms: 6-month engagement, fractional COO role. I'd work 4 days a week on site, 1 day remote for my other clients. They'd pay me an amount that made me slightly uncomfortable to ask for. David called me 2 days later. He said the team had reviewed my proposal. Tom was impressed. The board was supportive. They wanted to move forward. I accepted. For the first 2 months at Nexus, I kept my head down and focused on building credibility. I implemented basic project management frameworks. I cleaned up their client delivery process. I created documentation where none existed. The team was grateful. They'd been drowning in chaos, and suddenly someone was giving them structure and tools that actually helped them do their jobs better. Tom was effusive in his praise. He kept telling people I was the best hire he'd made all year, that we should have brought someone like me in years ago. I smiled and said I was just doing my job, but I was also paying attention, watching how Tom ran the company, seeing the mistakes he was making, understanding where Nexus was vulnerable, because around month 3 I started hearing things. Rumors that Nexus was in acquisition talks with a larger company. Tom wasn't saying anything publicly, but David let it slip during one of our check-ins. The acquiring company was doing due diligence. They wanted to make sure Nexus had solid operational infrastructure before finalizing the deal. That's why David had been so eager to bring me in. They needed someone to clean things up before the acquirer looked too closely. I asked David who the acquiring company was. Mahi said it was a private equity firm called Meridian Partners. My heart stopped. Meridian Partners was the same PE firm that had acquired Vertex. I went home that night and did research. Meridian had bought Vertex 14 months ago. The deal had closed for $32 million. Richard had walked away with most of that money since he'd owned the majority of shares. $32 million. I'd built the operational foundation that made that company worth $32 million, and Richard had fired me 7 months before the deal closed. I found articles about the acquisition. They quoted Jennifer Hartley, the COO who'd replaced me. She talked about the strong operational systems that had made Vertex an attractive acquisition target. She didn't mention my name once. I sat at my computer reading these articles, and something cold and clear settled over me. Richard had stolen 6 years of my life and $32 million of value I'd helped create. He'd fired me just before the finish line so he wouldn't have to share the payout. And now his PE firm was about to acquire another company, a company where I controlled operations. I didn't sleep that night. I was thinking, planning, seeing possibilities I hadn't seen before. The next morning, I asked David if I could schedule time to meet with the Meridian Partners team during their due diligence. I said it would be helpful for me to understand their expectations for operational infrastructure so I could make sure we were aligned. David thought that was proactive. He set up a call. The due diligence team from Meridian included 3 people. One of them was Victoria Marsh, the consultant who'd evaluated Vertex, the one who'd recommended firing me. She didn't recognize me on the video call. Why would she? I'd been just another line item in her operational assessment 2 years ago, but I recognized her. I kept my composure during the meeting. I walked them through everything I'd built at Nexus over the past 3 months, the project management systems, the resource planning frameworks, the client delivery processes. Victoria asked good questions. She wanted to understand scalability. She wanted to see metrics. She wanted documentation. I had all of it because I'd learned from being unprepared at Vertex. I'd built everything at Nexus to be defensible under exactly this kind of scrutiny. Victoria said she was impressed. Now, the operational infrastructure at Nexus was significantly more mature than she'd expected for a company of this size. I smiled and thanked her. After the call, I sat back and thought about what I knew. Meridian was acquiring Nexus. They valued strong operational systems. They'd paid premium prices for companies like Vertex that had their infrastructure together. And I controlled that infrastructure at Nexus. I scheduled a meeting with Tom and David. I said I needed to discuss my long-term role. The acquisition was coming together, and I wanted to understand how they saw me fitting into the post-acquisition structure. Tom said they absolutely wanted me to stay. Meridian had been clear that maintaining operational leadership through the transition was critical. They'd offer me a full-time role as COO with equity in the combined entity. I said I appreciated that, but I needed to be transparent. I'd built a successful consulting practice. Taking a full-time role meant giving up my other clients and my independence. I'd need to think carefully about whether that made sense. David looked concerned. He said my staying was probably a condition of the deal closing. Meridian wouldn't want to lose the person who'd built all the operational systems. I said I understood. I just needed time to consider what was right for me. I let that sit for a week, let them get nervous, let them realize how dependent they'd become on my work. Then I had a different conversation with David, private, just the 2 of us. I said I'd been thinking about the acquisition. I was excited about the possibility of staying on, but I wanted to understand the deal structure, specifically how equity was being distributed. David explained it. Tom would retain 20% of the combined entity. The board members, including David, would get small equity stakes. The rest would go to Meridian. I asked what the management team would get. David said there was some retention bonuses. Standard stuff to keep key people through the transition. I nodded. I said I'd need more than a retention bonus. If Meridian wanted me to stay as COO, and continue building operational infrastructure for the combined company, I'd need real equity. 3% of the post-acquisition entity, vesting over 4 years. David's eyes widened. He said that was a significant ask. I said I understood, but I also understood that Meridian's valuation of Nexus was based heavily on the operational maturity I'd created in 6 months. Yeah, without that infrastructure, they'd probably offer 20 to 30% less for the acquisition. I was asking for a tiny fraction of the value I'd created. David said he'd need to discuss it with Tom and the Meridian team. I said I'd be happy to discuss it with them directly if that helped. A few days later, I got a call from a Meridian partner I hadn't met before. His name was Robert Chen. He wanted to understand my request. I walked him through it calmly and professionally. I explained exactly what I'd built at Nexus. I showed him the metrics, demonstrating how operational improvements had directly impacted revenue and client retention. I explained how Meridian's valuation model weighted operational maturity. Then I said I'd learned from my past mistakes. I'd spent 6 years building operational infrastructure for another company, and I'd been pushed out right before the value was realized. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. If Meridian wanted me to stay and continue building, I needed to own a piece of what I was creating. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what would happen if they didn't agree to my terms. I said I'd continue my consulting engagement through the acquisition close. I'd document everything thoroughly. And then I'd return to my independent practice. Robert said they could hire another COO. I said they absolutely could, but that person would take 6 to 12 months to get up to speed, and in that time the operational systems would likely degrade, without someone who understood the nuances of how everything fit together. Also, I added, due diligence was based on current operational state. If that state degraded post-acquisition, there might be grounds to renegotiate deal terms. I wasn't threatening, I was just stating facts. Robert said he'd get back to me. 2 weeks later, David called me. He sounded almost giddy. Meridian had agreed to my terms. 3% equity, 4-year vest, with acceleration clauses if certain performance milestones were hit. I'd be a real owner of what I built. The acquisition closed 3 months later. Nexus became part of Meridian's portfolio. I became the COO of the combined entity, now called Nexus Industrial Solutions, and I owned 3% of it. But that wasn't the revenge. That was just the foundation. 6 months after the acquisition, Meridian decided to consolidate some operational functions across their portfolio companies. They wanted to create shared services and best practices that could benefit all their holdings. They asked me to lead the initiative. I said yes. The first company I reviewed was Vertex Solutions. I flew to Seattle for a week of operational assessment. I walked into the building where I'd spent 6 years of my life. Security didn't recognize me. I was just another consultant. Jennifer Hartley's assistant scheduled time for me to meet with her. I sat in a conference room waiting, the same conference room where Victoria had first interviewed me. Jennifer walked in looking stressed. She didn't recognize me either. She sat down and immediately started complaining about how chaotic things had been since the acquisition. Now Meridian kept asking for reports and metrics she didn't have. Her team was underwater. I let her talk for 10 minutes. Then I asked to see her operational documentation. She pulled up a few files. They were the frameworks I'd created 3 years ago. Nothing had been updated. Nothing had evolved. The systems I'd built were degrading because Jennifer didn't actually understand how they worked. I spent 3 days at Vertex reviewing everything. Then I wrote a comprehensive report for Meridian. My assessment was clear. Vertex's operational infrastructure had been strong at the time of acquisition, but it had deteriorated significantly. The current COO didn't understand the systems well enough to maintain or evolve them. The company was at risk of losing the operational efficiency that had justified the acquisition price. I recommended immediate remediation. Either Jennifer needed intensive coaching and support, or Meridian needed to consider alternative leadership. I sent the report to Robert Chen at Meridian. He called me the next day. He said my assessment aligned with concerns they'd been having. They'd been watching Vertex's margins compress and client satisfaction drop. They hadn't understood why until my report connected the dots. Robert asked if I'd be willing to step in directly, take over operations at Vertex while maintaining my responsibilities at Nexus. I said I could do it as a short-term intervention, 6 months, to stabilize operations and get the right leadership in place. Robert agreed. 2 weeks later, I walked into Vertex as the interim chief operating officer appointed by Meridian Partners. Jennifer was asked to step down. She was offered a generous severance package and a glowing reference letter, the same treatment Richard had given me. I didn't feel bad for her. She'd been happy to take my job knowing how I'd been pushed out. Now she was experiencing the same thing. My first day back at Vertex, I called an all-hands meeting. I stood in front of the company and introduced myself. Most people didn't know who I was. The original employees from my era were mostly gone. I said I was there to rebuild operational excellence. We were going to get back to basics, focus on delivering great work for clients, support our teams, build systems that actually served people. After the meeting, a few people approached me. They'd heard stories about someone named Marcus who'd built the original operational framework. They asked if I was that person. I said yes. And one of them, a project manager named Amy, said she'd seen my name in old documentation. She'd wondered what happened to me. I said I'd moved on to other opportunities, but now I was back. Over the next 6 months, I rebuilt everything. I updated the frameworks I'd originally created. I fixed the degradation Jennifer had allowed. I trained a new operations team on how to actually sustain the systems. And I found something interesting. While reviewing financial records, I discovered that Richard had taken certain shortcuts during the sale to Meridian. He'd inflated some metrics. He'd hidden some liabilities. Nothing illegal, but definitely ethically questionable. I documented everything and shared it with Robert. Robert was not happy. He said this explained some anomalies they'd found in Vertex's post-acquisition performance. The company hadn't been quite as strong as Richard had represented. I said I wasn't surprised. Richard had a pattern of prioritizing short-term wins over long-term integrity. Robert asked if I thought they'd overpaid for Vertex. I pulled up my analysis. Based on actual performance versus represented performance, yes, Meridian had probably overpaid by 15 to 20%. Robert thanked me for the information. He said it would factor into how they structured future deals. A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that Meridian had sued Richard for misrepresentation in the sale. The lawsuit alleged he'd knowingly inflated certain operational metrics during due diligence. They settled out of court, but Richard had to return several $1 million. I didn't initiate the lawsuit. I just provided accurate information about what I'd found, but the outcome felt like justice. Meanwhile, I was thriving. I was COO of Nexus Industrial Solutions. I had equity that was growing in value as we scaled. I was respected by Meridian's leadership. I was earning more than I'd ever imagined. And I'd proven that Victoria had been wrong. I could absolutely scale companies past $50 million. I was doing it. One day I got a message from Richard on LinkedIn. He wanted to connect and catch up. He'd heard I was doing well and wanted to congratulate me. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He was irrelevant to my life now. But I did get a message from someone else that mattered more. One of my former team members from Vertex. Her name was Priya, and she'd been one of my best operations managers. Now, she said she left Vertex 6 months ago. The culture had become toxic under Jennifer, but she'd heard I was back in the building. She wanted to know if I was hiring. I was. I brought Priya onto my team at Nexus. Then I hired 2 more people from my original Vertex crew, people who'd been loyal to me and had been ground up by the system after I left. We built something special together. The operations team at Nexus became known across Meridian's portfolio as the gold standard. Other portfolio companies asked to learn from our systems. 2 years after the Nexus acquisition, Meridian sold the company to a larger industrial conglomerate. The exit was significant, far larger than the Vertex deal. My 3% equity turned into life-changing money. I called Sarah from my car after the deal closed, when I was sitting in the parking lot trying to process what had just happened. We'd just become wealthy. Not fantasy wealthy, but genuinely financially independent wealthy. Sarah cried. She said she was proud of me, not for the money, for fighting my way back from the worst moment of my life and building something real. I cried too. That night we opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. We toasted to the journey, to the struggle, to finding out who I was when everything was stripped away. I thought about the Marcus who'd sat in his car in Vertex's parking lot 3 years ago, feeling completely broken. I wished I could tell him it would be okay, better than okay, but that Marcus needed to go through the fire to become who I am now. A few months after the Nexus exit, I was having coffee with David Park. Now, he'd made good money from the sale too and was looking at his next venture. He asked me what I was going to do next. I said I was thinking about it. I could retire, I could start my own firm, I could take on a few select consulting clients and work part-time. David suggested I consider teaching, sharing what I'd learned. He said I had a rare combination of practical experience and systematic thinking that most people never develop. That idea resonated. I ended up developing a course on building operational infrastructure for growing companies. I taught it through a couple of accelerator programs. Then I started doing workshops for other fractional executives. I wasn't doing it for money. I was doing it because I'd learned things the hard way, and maybe I could help other people avoid some of my mistakes. In one of those workshops, a young operations manager raised her hand and asked me a question. She said she was working at a fast-growing startup. She loved the work but felt undervalued. Her CEO kept making promises about equity and partnership, but nothing was formalized. Should she trust him? I told her to get everything in writing. If the CEO couldn't put promises in writing, they weren't real promises, and she should always have options. Never make herself so dependent on one company that losing her job would devastate her life. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't want to believe her CEO would betray her. I saw myself in her hope. After the workshop, I pulled her aside. I told her my story, not to scare her, just to give her information. I said her CEO might be completely genuine, but people change when money is involved. She needed to protect herself. Now, she thanked me. 6 months later, she sent me a message. Her CEO had tried to push her out right before a funding round, but she'd followed my advice. She had an employment contract with equity terms clearly defined. When he tried to fire her, she threatened legal action. They settled. She got her equity and a generous severance. She said my story had saved her from becoming another version of me. That message meant more than the money I'd made. 3 years after leaving Vertex, I was invited to speak at a tech leadership conference. The topic was building sustainable operations in high-growth companies. I almost declined. I don't love public speaking, but Sarah convinced me it was important to share what I'd learned. I prepared my talk carefully. I told my story, the rise, the betrayal, the fall, the rebuild, the revenge that came from success rather than destruction. I talked about the mistakes I'd made, tying my identity to a job, trusting promises that weren't formalized, sacrificing everything for someone else's vision. And I talked about what I'd learned. That real security comes from owning your value, not from loyalty to systems that don't value you. That success is the best revenge because it proves everyone who doubted you was wrong. The audience was quiet during my talk. Afterward, dozens of people came up to share their own stories. People who'd been fired unfairly, people who'd been pushed out right before big payouts, people who were struggling to rebuild. I listened to all of them. I gave advice where I could. I made connections for people who needed opportunities. And I realized this was the final piece of my revenge. Mine not just succeeding myself, but helping other people avoid being crushed the way I'd been crushed. Richard had tried to make me disposable. Instead, he'd inadvertently taught me how to become essential in a way he never could be. Victoria had said I couldn't scale companies past $50 million. I'd proven her wrong and helped other fractional executives do the same. Jennifer had taken my job thinking she was getting my success. She'd learned that systems without understanding are just documentation. All of them had underestimated me because they'd confused compliance with weakness. They'd thought my willingness to work hard meant I'd accept anything. They were wrong. Today, I run a small consulting firm focused on operational infrastructure for growth stage companies. I take on 4 or 5 clients a year. I charge rates that reflect my value. I work with people I respect. I still have equity in several companies I've helped build. Some of them will exit eventually and generate more wealth. Some won't. I'm okay either way because my security doesn't depend on any single outcome. Sarah and I have 2 kids now. I coach my son's soccer team. I don't miss games for client meetings. I don't check email at dinner. I've learned what actually matters. Sometimes I look up Vertex Solutions out of curiosity. The company still exists under Meridian's ownership. They've gone through 3 COOs since Jennifer. The employee reviews online talk about chaos and turnover and stress. The operational foundation I built is completely gone now. They've rebuilt everything multiple times, each time a little worse. I don't feel bad about that. When I gave them 6 years of excellent work, they chose to destroy it after I left. That's on them. Occasionally, I see Richard at industry events. We don't speak. He knows what he did. I know what I've become. That's enough. The other day, a recruiter reached out about a COO role at a well-funded startup. Great salary, equity package, opportunity to build something meaningful. 5 years ago, I would have jumped at it, desperate to prove my worth, eager to rebuild what I'd lost. Now, I politely declined. I told the recruiter I'm focused on my consulting practice and teaching. If the startup needed short-term operational infrastructure work, I'd be happy to discuss a consulting engagement. Otherwise, I could recommend some excellent full-time candidates. The recruiter seemed surprised. She said most people would kill for this opportunity. I said I used to be most people. I'm not anymore. That's the real revenge. Not crushing Richard or destroying Vertex or proving Victoria wrong, though all of those things brought satisfaction. The real revenge is becoming someone who can't be destroyed by other people's betrayal. Someone who owns their value. Someone who chooses their path instead of desperately clinging to whatever path is offered. Richard forced me out thinking it would break me. Instead, it freed me from needing his validation. I built a life on my own terms. That's something he can never take away. And that's a story I tell young operations professionals now. Not to scare them about betrayal, but to help them understand that your value doesn't come from any single company or role. It comes from your skills, your integrity, and your willingness to keep building even when everything falls apart. Some people will underestimate you. Some people will betray you. Some people will try to convince you that you're not enough. They're wrong. You just have to be willing to prove it. Not to them, to yourself. That's what I learned from being forced out and coming back on my own terms. And honestly, I wouldn't change anything, because the person I became through that struggle is someone I'm actually proud to be. If you've ever been betrayed at work, you're not alone. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe to Office Revenge Hub for more powerful workplace revenge stories.